Hello, it's Johnny here. Welcome to our channel, and we are really pleased to be able to share with you the results of one of our recent lunch and learns that we host regularly with Campaign Force, and that was on demystifying Russia, delivered by Shane Mason, who is a Royal Navy veteran and an academic and advisor on grand strategy. Now, in this next video that you're about to see, you'll find out about the history of Russia, what motivates them, what makes them tick, in order for you to be able to have a better informed position on why Russia acts the way it is, particularly in the context of Ukraine. So do subscribe to our channel because you're going to get more of these coming up in the future. And in the meantime, I'll hand you over to Shane. Shane, welcome to today's webinar, Lunch and Learn for Campaign Force on demystifying Russia. Over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining, and thank you to Johnny and the efforts of Campaign Force for all the hard work in putting this webinar and all the other events, podcasts, articles, and everything else they do together for us and for the community. They do brilliant work indeed. So if you can afford to make a small donation in lieu of charging for this event, please do. It really does help the fantastic work that they do. So over the course of the next 60 minutes, we'll go through some academic research which looks to enhance our understanding of Russia as a nation state with a political identity, and also look to understand what drives some of its strategic political thinking and its ambitions. But before we do, I just want to put a few ground rules into place to help create a shared understanding amongst us all. Firstly, the work is not designed to paint Russia as a good or bad actor. I'm absolutely not here to do that. What I am here to do is to share information to develop, if you like a hypothesis, which can perhaps help explain or demystify why Russia behaves the way it does. Well, what do we mean by this? Well, I could either drop an anvil on your foot, or I could throw you a life buoy. In one situation, I'm a goodie. In the other, I'm a baddie. But in either dropping an anvil or throwing a life buoy, there's a theory for how gravity works. And I'm here to help develop the theory and not sway your thinking. Secondly, the great military strategist Karl von Clausewitz once said that war is merely the continuation of political policy by other means. And I read geopolitics, or what is commonly known as world affairs, at Cambridge, and not war studies at King's College London or elsewhere. As such, the content of this talk doesn't go into any great depth of Russia's military conquests, as that is an area of inquiry that's really best suited for Cranfield or the Royal United Services Institute, etc. What I seek to understand is why states behave the way they do, and that's the realm of geopolitics. Think of my area of inquiry being state behaviors and relationships, or if you like, the stuff that doesn't work too well and ends up in a war, if you like. So this talk, lecture, or whatever we want to call it, is shaped around the geopolitics of Russia. And by looking at some key events over its history and contrasting those events with established and practiced theories in international relations. By doing this, we observe characteristics of Russia to help demystify its strategic ambitions. And lastly, while this work is indeed entirely original, I must show hearty appreciation to Professor Brendan Sims at the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge, who has been an immense influence on my research and work to date, including this piece, of course, alongside Baroness Julie Smith, who directs international relations at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge, who is also a truly fantastic academic supervisor. I sincerely do hope you will enjoy the next 45 minutes or so. This is only the second, and indeed it will be the last time I give this talk before I move on to other research pieces. So if you hear paper turning, that's because despite being blessed to have the brain deemed decent enough to walk the same corridors, passages and classrooms as the likes of Turing, Hawking and Newton, the truth is I'm a mere mortal from a council estate in South London who just can't remember 45 minutes of lecture notes. So without any more further delay, let's get started in having a look at Russia's history to try and demystify it. Could we go to slide 2, please, Johnny? Excellent, thank you very much. So Russia is a country with 11 time zones that spans 2 continents. It has a landmass which is approximately around 70 times that of the United Kingdom, excuse me, and it's home to over 100 different languages and it's assumed the political identity of an autocratic empire, an authoritarian Soviet republic, and a liberalizing federation, all within a couple of hundred years, which is actually quite astounding when you think about it. But with so many dynamics, it's absolutely no surprise that Russia is a complex country for almost anyone in any professional field to truly appreciate, yet alone fully understand. In the West, we're all conditioned to interpret nations since our primary educations by learning about the people and their cultures, such as the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings, the Greeks, etc., by learning their customs and their characteristics, what they ate, the clothes they wore, how they danced, and the weapons they used. So we tend to characterize and storytell in order to understand the nation and its people. But with Russia, there are so many variances to its heritage and indeed its history, which we'll find out, that it is both impossible and misleading to characterize Russia in any one historical era or in any one part of its geography. With such geographic characteristics combined with a deep and varied geopolitical and social history, it is really no wonder Sir Winston Churchill once said of Russia, "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." He said that as First Lord of the Admiralty via BBC, I believe it was World Service or Radio 2, in 1939. So even a seasoned politician and military officer such as Churchill openly acknowledged the difficulties of understanding Russia. However, the part of the quote which is often ignored and never really reviewed was that Churchill continued by saying, "But perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest." Can we go to slide 3, please, Johnny? Thank you. So, what do we feel are Russia's national interests? Can we quickly take one or two very quick thoughts from anyone before swiftly moving on? Does anyone have any thoughts about what are Russia's strategic ambitions? Does anyone want to come off mute and have a stab?
A warm weather port.
Yep, that could be, yep, absolutely. Anyone else?
Free of influence of NATO.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, possibly. One more. Should we take one more? No? Okay, well, okay. So those are a couple of very decent ideas and thoughts that are worth developing further. And to do so, we need two things. We need context and we need evidence. And the best way to attain these is often in history, which is now where we turn. Can we go to slide 4, please, Johnny? Brilliant. So the first period we look to draw evidence and context from is imperialist Russia, where Russia's ability to outsurvive its neighboring nations' decline in power at the time, such as the Swedish and Ottoman empires and even China, and that was in the 17th and early 18th centuries, lent Russia the opportunity to establish itself with a reformed identity as what is known as a great power nation. Now, you will hear this term a lot, especially at the moment, where, as Liz Truss said as Foreign Secretary, geopolitics is back in town. So could we go to slide 5, please, Johnny? So it's worth pausing here for a quick minute to ask what we feel a great power nation is. Can we have another quick couple of comments from anyone on the call, what they feel a great power nation is?
A military capability, both land, sea, and air.
Possibly, yeah. Characters of a great power nation, yeah.
Somebody who's able to sort of get their own way and bring influence to bear to achieve the outcomes that they want to.
Yeah, influence is really quite key. Absolutely. Okay, cool. So there's some decent erudite thoughts there and some words of wisdom coming from us today. So that's really good. To define what a great power nation is, I'm guided by someone who is a titan of great power politics, and that's Professor Brendan Sims. I mentioned him earlier in my opening. And reading his books and attending his lecture series on great powers gives the clear impression that a great power nation is one which has material capacity to either challenge or stabilize the global power balance. Material capacity is being the source of a nation's economic and military influence. There are other theories, of course, which, I mean, some of which say the characteristic or the way to tell a great power nation is that they possess at least 5% of all the arms of the nation states around the globe. And there's other ways of measuring what a great power nation is. However, I believe that it's a nation which can destabilize the global power balance, or actually stabilize the global power balance, just by having political influence and not actually taking any economic action or military action. Can we go to slide 6, please, Johnny? Okay. Right. So going back to imperialist Russia, the intention of Russia establishing itself as a great power nation was exhibited in 1721 with the Russian Senate, where they proclaimed Tsar Peter I as Emperor of Russia, which resulted in the establishment of Russia's self-expectation as a conquest nation. This self-identity as a conquest nation and Russia's expectation which came with it was thus recognized by European powers, France, Prussia, and the Habsburg monarchy of Germany, upon Russia becoming a guarantor of peace in 1779 as a result of the Teschen Treaty at the end of the Bavarian War. We can see in the top left image in front of us what is supposed to depict France, Prussia, and Habsburg's the diplomats convening at the time. Further, the 1812 invasion of Russia by Napoleon's forces, who failed to hold Moscow due to poor weather and difficult terrain, illustrates that Russia, as a great power nation, had geographic vulnerabilities as well as strengths. However, Russia's willing to burn Moscow to the ground rather than leave it to enemy forces demonstrated Russia's capability to not only tolerate zero-sum military methods, but it's willing to sacrifice itself in defiance of an enemy. It actually illustrates Russia's dedication to not showing any weakness whatsoever, even at a point of foreign invasion. So this act of defiance was endorsed by European powers in 1815 at what is known as the Congress of Vienna. We see that in the middle image. And that's with Russia being recognized as one of the 4 great European powers, alongside Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain. That included Article 6, which pledged that the parties should meet regularly in order to maintain the European power of balance. So we see here that Russia's role as a strong and defiant great power, which it set itself by establishing itself as a conquest nation in 1721, was thus legitimized by European power politics as a result of Russia's military conquests and military defense. So such recognition actually enhanced Russia's own understanding of its ongoing role of Europe from that point onwards, as well as it also affirmed its influence by other European states as well, as actually a great power. So it was therefore legitimized. The other European powers actually viewed Russia as a state which could bring balance to the uncertainty and violence across Europe. However, by 1917, Russia's ambitions to establish an identity as a defiant and strong great power, recognized by neighboring and allied nations, was challenged by its very own people. Tsar Nicholas II, by putting Russia's international commitments before national needs, had inadvertently pressurized society into a civil war fought between the Bolshevik Red Army of the working class, which mostly consisted of farmers, peasants, and conscripted soldiers, against the bourgeois White Army of military officers, Cossacks, and landowners. Could we go to slide 7, please? Cool, thank you. So what do these key events in imperialist Russian history lead us to observe? Okay, firstly, they inform us that Russia is a nation willing to destroy its own cities, its own rulers, and even its own political system. However, whilst Russia is willing to break itself, it is equally willing to adopt a state identity and to cooperate internationally to legitimize itself, as we saw in the Teschen Treaty and as we saw at the Congress of Vienna. This cooperation extends to trade alongside military protection as well, and that was demonstrated by the likes of the discovery of Alaska and setting up trade routes across Asia, Europe, and Siberia during the imperial era. And whilst its state-to-state external cooperation made Russia a recognized great power to other nations in the 18th and 19th centuries, by inclusion in these what we call great power meetings, there is a simultaneous weakness through demonstrating a distinct inability to effectively survive at a national level. And that's essentially a failure from the perspective of Western realist theory. So we see here through the imperialist part of Russia's history that Russia's actions are not reflected in mainstream geopolitical Western theory. And that lends us to start to observe why the even seasoned statesmen such as Churchill couldn't unravel the mystery of Russia. And Russia's imperialist history also enables us to begin understanding Russia's behaviors and cultural identity around being a conquest and great power nation. And I would argue that's part of its political DNA, which dates back to 1721, or 300 years. Could we go to slide 8, please, Johnny? So in the interest of time, we now swiftly move on to our next period of Russian history to draw observations from, and that's Soviet Russia. From 1917 to 1923, the Russian Civil War resulted in between 7 to 12 million deaths, and it marked the end of Russia's involvement in the Great War. The actual figure of deaths is greatly debated amongst many historians even to this day. Yet despite the bloodshed in the name of socialism, in 1921, Lenin reverted to capitalism by enacting what was called the new economic policy across the Soviet Union, allowing the peasants to trade freely in their surplus agricultural produce in whatever is left over in the tax after it's collected. And that's the actual quote from the party policy at the time. This actually resulted in a now revolutionized socialist Soviet Russia, indicating a willing to bend its own ideology and policies as opposed to admit defeat or failure. In this instance, the failure to provide the better standards of equality in society which socialism had so promised the people at the outbreak of the revolution. So alongside a willing to bend its ideology, Soviet Russia was more than willing to actually instill fear in its own people. And this was exhibited by the Red Terror campaign, where between 1918 and 1922, anyone deemed enemies of the Bolsheviks were publicly beaten, they were arrested, they were executed, or they just simply went missing by being snatched by Soviet secret police in the night. And that resulted alone in somewhere between 50,000 to 200,000 people being killed, and many more thousands being sent to gulags of forced labor. Again, nobody actually knows the number, but everyone agrees it is at least 50,000. But mass death was obviously a regular occurrence during Soviet Russian history, where between 1930 to 1933, the Soviet famine killed between 5.7 to 8.7 million people in the grain-producing areas of Ukraine, Caucasus, Kazakhstan, and the southern Urals and western Siberia. Again, it's at least 5.7 million, but people believe it's around 8.7 million. There's also it's hotly debated whether the Soviet famine was actually a genocide because it focused on non-Russian states and non-Russian people. So in 1934, the USSR was also admitted as a permanent member of the League of Nations, quite surprising at the time, many may think. But it was expelled in December 1939 following its invasion of Finland. It was whilst the USSR was a member of the League of Nations between 36 and March of 38 that Stalin, through fear of a social uprising, instigated a purge against past and potential political opponents. And this actually included anyone who could be viewed as a source of alternative thinking to socialism, scientists, academics, poets, etc. That alone resulted in at least 700,000 people. It's estimated that it's more closer to 1 million people believed to have been executed, massacred, and butchered and murdered as a result. Following the surrender of Nazi Germany and Japan in 1945, the USSR, interestingly enough, recognized the world has shifted from one of a multipolar system where various different political influences operated and didn't, where there was essentially only two nations that maintained the great power status, therefore bringing it to like a bipolar system. And that was itself in the United States of America. So as such, from 1945, the USSR, recognizing Britain's importance in European affairs, began courting Great Britain as an ally in Europe as part of its intentions to seek a role as itself as the greatest influence on the continent. and subsequently the greatest power in the world. It's important to note here that Europe had been the ground for the last 4 wars which influenced the global power balance: the Holy Roman Empire Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, the Great War, and the Second World War. Hence, it was believed at the time that whoever had the most control and influence in and through Europe had the source of global dominance. And this was essentially what both the USA and USSR recognized. And secondly, they both recognized that Britain played a key role in Europe and in European military and diplomatic affairs especially, and was an established great power nation. But unfortunately for Russia, the economic and industrial support enabled by the USA via the Marshall Plan, which was a plan set up by Senator George Marshall in 1947 for 15 billion US dollars of economic and military support throughout Europe, which the UK played a very key role in helping shaping and deciding what was spent on whom, what and where, etc. But it was the Marshall Plan which served as a foundation for the US-UK special relationship. And the subsequent alignment between the UK and the USA took the United Kingdom off the table as a source of European and global influence for the USSR. So the USSR, seeking to gain the UK as an ally, was a failed predatory policy where rising power, in this case the USSR, will prey upon a declining state, in this instance the UK, as the declining state would offer the predatory state some form of what is known as utility in imposing another great power, and in this instance it's the USA. So the USSR ultimately misjudged the situation, as the USA then counteracted their predatory policy by adopting what's called a supportive strategy to the declining state, in this case the UK, and that was in the form of the military and economic assistance. So, and by the way, in predatory theory is widely accepted as by academics, which reflects how nation states use declining powers or weakening states to enhance their own influences. So what then ensued was the USA and USSR entering a period of competition for world supremacy known as the Cold War, where capitalism and democracy were competing against and competing with the ideology of socialist control and communism. This period of political, economic, and ideological competition led to the USSR detonating its first atomic device in 1949, 4 years after the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The USSR establishing the Warsaw Pact in 1955, following the foundation of NATO in 1949. And there was even a space race from the late 1950s, which ended up the world seeing its first satellite navigation low Earth orbit, as well as man setting foot on the moon for the first time. And the Cold War also included a number of proxy wars and quite an intense standoff between the two sides, with the USSR positioning ballistic missiles in Cuba as a result of the USA positioning ballistic missiles in Turkey and Italy. But thankfully, there was an eventual agreement from both sides, resulting in de-escalation. The diplomatic, economic, and military developments and race for global influence resulted in the USSR and the USA both becoming known what are termed these days as superpowers. Can we go to slide 9, please, Johnny? So what is a superpower? Could we take another couple of quick comments from those, maybe those who perhaps haven't had a chance to say anything yet, on what a superpower is? Does anyone have any thoughts? Anyone? What is a superpower? Is anyone able to come off mute?
Yeah, go on, Shane. I don't think I answered this last time I heard you speak. It's a term used to describe a state with a dominant position, really. Able to influence or exert influence on a global, down a global scale. Not like the UK with our soft power, with our bounds, for instance. Over to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, as a superpower can be defined in different ways, as there is, of course, there's more than one way to explain geopolitics. However, I tend to argue that superpowers emerge in areas of bipolarity or unipolarity, when one or two nation states who already possess a great power status are able to influence the world in their own image. And that's not necessarily to shape the world, who look to act as itself. They're not looking to necessarily force other nation states to be like it. but it's sometimes just to shape the world to look or act how they want those nation states to look or act. And that may not necessarily be as themselves. And this is important. But social identity theory also informs us that nation states, and Russia included, of course, always seek some form of differentiation or unique status in pursuit of influence. Some people, I've heard this referred to as the Jungle Book effect. Ooby-Doo, I want to be like you. So can we go to slide 10, please, Johnny? Okay, right. So what can we observe from the Soviet era? There is a theory known as grand strategy theory, which explains what is termed psychotic behavior. And psychotic behavior recognizes that countries or those that lead them seek prestige, satisfaction, or some form of glory are nations which fundamentally are aggressors, and they behave violently towards other nations or violently towards their own people. And they do that to create a pattern of behavior which illustrates a potential outbreak of war, to quell potential civil unrest in order to compel weaker states. And that's quite, again, that's quite exhibited, especially in the Stalinist era of Russian Soviet history. The early indications of grand strategy theory, and this what is academically termed psychotic behavior, are seen in December 1922, where delegations from Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, and Armenia convened to approve the treaty of the creation of the USSR, which then brought the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into a legal existence, with eventually 15 nations participating. So the USSR's acceptance into an expulsion from the League of Nations also indicates two observations. Firstly, that Russia's treatment of its own people was a matter of lesser importance to the international community compared to how Russia treats its own nation. So, or Russia treats other nations. So by accepting Russia into the League of Nations, gave an impression that how Russia treated its own people was lesser importance compared to how it treats other people. So, but this can be explained by another observation, that international organizations at the time, especially, had a criterion for standards of civilization in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that was designed to both distinguish between civilized and uncivilized states, and then determine membership to the international society. And it was actually also designed to compel aspiring members to act European, if you like. So it was an attempt to Europeanize other nations. Further, the USSR's actions of one-upmanship and conflict with the USA during the Cold War reflects social identity theory, in that when a group's identity is threatened, it enters what's called social competition by trying to equal or surpass a dominant group in an area which claims to have superiority. Excuse me, thank you. However, the policy of social competition, as we know, ultimately failed for USSR, with the outcome of the Cold War resulting in the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the USA achieving hegemony or world leadership. Can we go to slide 11, please, Johnny? Okay, so now let's take a brief look at the Russian Federation. It was in 1986 that public dissatisfaction against communism commenced across the Soviet Union via student demonstrations in Kazakhstan and spread into workers' strike movements in Poland, which then led to a trend of movements across East Germany, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Quite a symbolic moment emerged in November 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which unified East and West Germany. And 3 weeks later, US President Bush and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev met in Malta to declare an end to the Cold War. In 1990, it was Lithuania who became the first Soviet Union member state to declare full independence, with other Soviet Union member states following suit. And in December 1991, the Bolshevik Accords were signed between Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, which declared an end to the legal existence of the USSR. Can we go to slide 12, please, Johnny? So what can we observe from the Russian Federation? Well, the dissolution of the Soviet Union resulted in the 15 republics taking various political paths. Ukraine became independent and pursued a westernized democratic path, yet, as we all know, has been in military conflict with Russia, including in the Crimea region, which has ebbed between independence and unification with Russia, since Khrushchev gave it to the Ukraine in 1953. Belarus has maintained close ties with Russia and remains in close political, economic, and military cooperation. Moldova has slowly moved towards capitalism and EU membership. Kazakhstan has remained largely autocratic, but has experienced significant economic growth due to its natural resources and it's also capitalist markets as a result of its natural resources. However, it's Kazakhstan's political ideology and military cooperation results in close ties with Russia, so there's still a close tie there. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia has since become very pro-Western, and they have lots of capitalist markets that operate in and out and through. They have democratic governance, and they're members of both NATO and the EU, as we know. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan have maintained close ties with Russia, especially economically. Kyrgyzstan remains in close economic cooperation with Russia, yet does tend to have tendencies of public support for liberal policies. Tajikistan remains under an authoritarian regime following a Russian-backed, I think it was a 5-year internal war in 1992, and that resulted in a communist leader taking power. Turkmenistan remains a highly authoritarian autocratic regime, but again, rich with natural resources. And the Transcaucasia countries of Armenia and Azerbaijan have been in conflict over territorial disputes fueled by religious differences and natural resource claims. And finally, Georgia is subject to a split between pro-Western and pro-Russian separatists, where in 2008, as we all know, Russian forces crossed the border to aid the pro-Russians. The dynamic of these relations maintained by Russia since the dissolution of the Soviet Union does strongly indicate that Russia is indeed attempting to rebuild a sphere of influence by creating a bloc with a European Christian Orthodox heartland under its leadership and a surrounding buffer of relatively weak states, which it will in varying degrees dominate. However, Russia claims not to be rebuilding an empire or aiming for superpower status. And this was actually captured by the BBC, where Russian President Vladimir Putin was asked in a 2019 press conference, is Russia a superpower again? And then he replied, we're not seeking this status. We don't want to return to how it was when the Soviet Union imposed a way of life and political system on its neighbors, including countries in Eastern Europe. But it seems that some of our partners in the West have not learned from the sad experience of the Soviet Union. They're repeating the same mistakes since they themselves are empires and carry out imperialist policy. Could we go to slide 13, please? Okay, thank you. So whilst we've now had what is admittedly a brief tour de force of Russian political history, I just wanted to finish off with an exercise which was shared to me by a very good friend who spent many years working in government, who said to me, Shane, if you ever want to understand what a nation state culturally believes in itself, listen to the words, if it has any words, and the music of a nation's national anthem. Excellent. Thank you very much, Johnny. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. Could we go to the next slide, slide 14, please, Johnny?
It worked in the rehearsal.
It did, actually.
Hang on. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, brilliant. So if we could, some of us come off mute again. Can we take a couple of comments around what we feel Russia believes in itself just by listening and reading the words to its national anthem? Does anyone have any observations about it that they wish to share?
Well, Neil put in the chat, nothing if not brief about the anthem.
Yeah, I was just going to say scale seems to be very important. Be that either from the length of the national anthem, the terms they were using, the sort of repetition, the grandeur. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of interesting enough. I think scale is correct. Russia's national anthem is one of the anthems where there's multiple voices singing the same thing at one time. So there's a lot of solidarity which comes through with it. It's very triumphant as well, isn't it, Neil? There's rises, and it's quite stirring. I mean, let's be fair. It's actually quite a stirring, quite a triumphant national anthem. But there's a lot of sorrow as well. You hear that in the drops in the chords. So I think just the music in itself says a lot, but also the word land comes up a lot, and you can see land and motherland that comes up a lot. So there's a great sense of ownership, isn't there? Territorial ownership really does come through, so I think that's very good input. Does anyone else have any thoughts of the Russian?
I know Joe's had problems with the camera, but he's put in the chat box, exceptionalism comes to mind. Yeah,
exceptionalism, and Joe, I mean, this? If you got problems with your camera and mic, I'm going to take that, and maybe I'm incorrect, as part of the differentiation that Russia's seeking to create itself. So the exceptionalism, yeah, I get that, where it's looking to be exceptional, and be exceptional in comparison to other nation states, maybe regionally surrounding itself as well, especially where land is concerned. Russia's a very land-focused nation, but exceptions are very, very good piece of input. Anyone else?
I think there's two things for me. One is there's a very strong reference to glory all the way through it. So a sense of their place as having maybe the impression is that they are great and that therefore they must be great. The other thing that sort of comes through, and it might just be a translation thing, is sort of the use of the second person, that they refer to the land, to the country sort of as the motherland, but don't refer to themselves almost as part of that. It's almost like they are part of something else, but it's not them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a very good point. Very good point indeed.
I'm not allowed to crack the funny about Sean Connery again on the Copyright October, am I, Shane?
You can do if you like.
Well, I think the fact that it's very stirring, and the use of the word motherland and bring to the bosom and sort of all of that again it's very nationalistic as well. That and it would quite stirring. It doesn't matter who you are. It sort of invokes emotion.
It does indeed. It really does indeed. So can we go to slide 15, please, Johnny? So that's really excellent thoughts and feedback there. Thank you very much. But I think it's safe to argue that Russia's national anthem suggests that Russia's history and ideology plays strongly through to how it views itself in the world. So to conclude and lead us into some open discussion with one another, I just wanted to share some observations and behind from the research that's gone into this, some findings from the work. So I want to start off by commenting that Russia does not treat winning or losing in either political or military affairs like we do in the West. Its survival, as we have seen, is not of paramount importance. This is because it is both willing to destroy its own nation, even burn its own cities to the ground, rather than face even a partial loss. It's also willing to bend its own policies and rules rather than admit defeat, as we saw with Lenin in a new economic policy. So winning and losing is not viewed the same as we see it. Russia sees that very differently. This means that when dealing with Russia, you must always be in a position to offer it an exit from the situations it finds itself within. Not doing so would lead to some escalation, and we see through Russia's history that it is indeed very willing to accept the use of violence on others and indeed its own people. So letting Russia entangle itself into a fight whilst defending oneself is perhaps the best way to deal with Russia. Can we go to slide 16, please? Okay, we also see that Russia seeks uniqueness for itself, as we've observed a few times. And this is really brought out by its continually changing and inconsistent ideology, alongside its focus on being some form of centralized nucleus to surrounding states. With both, interesting enough, with both Christian and Muslim nations, so a combination. This is therefore quite purposeful because it does not seek to adopt any one single identity. We also see that Russia not maintaining consistent status of membership to international organizations where strong cultural customs and norms of behavior exist, and indeed they're expected by member states. And that's even down to ignoring the norms of international constitutional law with its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council and its invasion of Ukraine. And lastly, I want to argue that Russia's strength is from the same source as its weakness, which perhaps explains some of those words shared by Churchill in 1939 of Russia being a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And this is amply exemplified by Russia's, and I quote the academic terminology, and this is of course not a personal opinion, Russia's psychotic behavior, where it's willing to essentially murder millions of its own people through fear of uprising. Yet it is equally looking to leverage the power of its people to suppress and defend. We see this through its military endeavors too. And despite the brilliance of Russia's people through amazing talents such as the culture of ballet art and some of the world's best classical music, it seems as though its history does show that the Russian state fears its own people, and because it knows that they can and they do rise up and revolt, at least historically anyway. So it's with these findings that we come to an end of this talk. I do really sincerely hope that you've enjoyed yourselves as much as I have spent the last several months researching and putting this information together. And I hope the last 40 or so minutes has helped us understand Russia a little bit more, so that we can perhaps understand Russia and what drives its behaviors and ambitions. So many thanks indeed. It might be worth just flicking through the last few slides, Johnny, of references to the work that went into this. And what I'll do is I'll now hand back to you, Johnny, for some open discussion where we can do a bit more talking, and perhaps I can do a bit more listening as well. So thank you all very, very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and over to you, Johnny.